Okay, this video is going to be about domain. Whoops, need the pen. Domain and range for modeling problems. So we learned that the domain, as a reminder, is the independent variable, and range is the dependent variable. So typically, when we sketch a graph, we want to put independent. I'm just showing quadrant 1 in my graph here because a lot of the modeling problems are only in quadrant 1. Not all, but a lot of them are. And the dependent is on the y-axis. And so we want to remember that they'll usually say whatever quantity, we might see some phraseology like this, depends on another quantity. So this quantity would be the independent, yeah. No, sorry, that's dependent. Sorry. So that's the dependent because it depends. And that would be the independent. A lot of times that's time, but not always. So we want to talk about sketching reasonable graphs and deciding on a reasonable domain and range. And let me tell you why we're considering this. As I talk with Mr. Zuka about the course, he says things like, what if we give him a problem like this? So you can see that I have an equation typed in here into Desmos, and I should see a graph. This is my standard window. The domain goes from negative 10 to 10, and the range also goes from negative 10 to 10. What we have up here is that might be the equation for some growth of money. That equation, which we'll get to later in the year, would represent a $5,000 investment that, say, grows at 18% per year. And we should see a graph that tells us what that we can refer to look at the relationship between the time passed in years and how much money you have in the account. So he says typically what happens is students might type this in Desmos and go, oh, Desmos is broken, I'm not getting a graph. It's not that at all. It's that we're not understanding what a reasonable domain is. What kind of numbers are we talking about? We're not talking about 0 to 10 on the y-axis here. That's only $10. You start at 5,000. So he said then the students will just kind of zoom out and go, okay, there it is. Now I see a graph. Well, that graph's not very helpful. We can't pull data off it. So instead of just zooming out, you got to consider what's a reasonable. So if I go into settings, what's a reasonable domain? So for my x-axis, where it says negative 1,791, I want to change that to 0, let's say, because x represents years in this problem, right? Y is the amount of money you have in the account. X is the number of years passed. So maybe we only want to know for 20 years. Okay? Now let's look at our graph. It goes from 0 to 20. That's a little better. Let's look at our range now. If the starting amount is $5,000, maybe we start at like 4,800 just to get a look on the y-axis, and maybe it's going to grow to 20,000 or more. So I'll just say 20,000 and see what that looks like. That's a reasonable domain and range. I've considered what the x represents and what are the numbers I'm looking for, or what I think they will be, what makes sense, and I've considered the y-axis, what that represents, and what possible numbers those might be. So that's kind of the issue we're trying to set you up to avoid. You should know where to look on the graph. We need to know a reasonable domain and range. So that's why we're talking about this now. So let's get back to what we were doing here. Here's some examples that we're going to ask you to do. Here's one. As you breathe, the volume of air in your lungs depends upon time. Now we're going to ask you to sketch a reasonable graph. You have to consider a reasonable domain and range. So as I think about breathing and the volume of air in your lungs, I'm going to do so. First of all, sorry, it says depends. So the volume depends upon time. So that means our volume is the dependent axis, time is the independent axis. Now I'm just going to do breaths, let's say 10 breaths or something. How long does it take to take a breath? Maybe a second and a half, maybe 2 seconds, depends on your breathing rate. So what's my domain going to be? Well, it's going to go from 0 to, I don't know, let's do a minute. Okay? Now I should talk or think about, I didn't really space these out in the bottom, but how far apart do I need to make these? Maybe I'm going to show, I'm just going to kind of estimate. That might not be exactly the middle, but there's 30 seconds, and then half of that is 15 seconds, and then that's 45. Maybe that's good enough for now. That's the most detail we need. Volume of air in the lungs, this is time in seconds. Volume of air, we're going to do milliliters. So milliliters in your lungs, it's anywhere from 2,000, at any one time, 2,000 to, you could have, say, 5,000, maybe even 10,000, somewhere around that range. So what I need to do is, I want to put a little break in the graph that shows I'm skipping a whole bunch of numbers. We want to start at 2,000. And maybe I want to go up to 10,000. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ooh, I was one short. 3, 4, 5. Okay, so now when I start graphing this, 2,000 might be when I've exhaled. So here's an exhale. I'm going to start there. And then as I inhale, maybe I go up to 4,000 and then back down to 2. So there I'm breathing, okay? Oh, there's a deep breath. Maybe it was a yawn. I don't know. Stuff like that, right? You could also have it growing. Now, I went outside my domain, but that's okay. What would be happening there as it's growing? Maybe I'm doing exercise or activity. That might be a reasonable graph, but I've decided the important part is my domain and my range, and we're going to do some practice with this. So make sure you watch this and take notes. That counts as your homework.